show. Today we have Kylie Bice on the line with us talking about Gifted. Thanks very much for joining us, Kylie.
No problem. It's lovely to be here.
Now, Kylie and I have bumped into each other at meetings and at conferences and get-togethers around the in the Gifted community for a number of years now, but I really don't know her terribly well. So I thought this would be a great opportunity to get to know you a little bit better, Kylie, and of course, pick your brains about what Gifted is and how we can help educators out there to identify gifted kids and some of the traits and struggles that gifted kids have in the classroom. So welcome, and tell us a little bit about yourself, Kylie, because as I said, we don't know you very well at all. Take it away.
Yeah, all right. Well, hello. I am an education consultant. I currently work with my own business, Growing Up Greatness, and before that was a consultant in other organisations as well, and before that was a teacher in schools working with students with disabilities and gifted and talented students, and long before that a teacher in secondary classrooms as well. But now I work with all sorts of schools, primary to secondary, government, Catholic, independent, and I also volunteer with Gifted WA and the AAEGT, which is the Australian Association for the Education of the Gifted and Talented. So I do a lot of work with a lot of different schools, and I'm really lucky, I think, to get a real insight into what happens in lots of different schools, particularly around Western Australia where I'm based.
How did you get into all this, Kylie? Because Gifted is extremely niche and it's very misunderstood and not very out there amongst the general public and the general population, I guess. Can you tell us a bit of backstory about how you got started in all this?
Yeah, sure. It's partly interest and partly fluke. I think I've always been interested in kids who sit outside the norm in my classrooms. I've always been interested in the kids who are sort of on the fringes and not necessarily being engaged by the standard work that's given to them. And then I happened in my very first year of teaching, happened to be the year in WA where the government, the education department for the government launched a new gifted program. It was called TAGS back then. And I was a little bit under load as a new graduate, and they gave me this big file, a TAGS file, and said, hey, do you want to do this and teach us about whatever's in this file? And I said, sure, I'll give it a go. And the rest is kind of history. I've sort of been on that journey ever since to try and understand and better teach those kids and students who sit on the fringes of classrooms and are not necessarily engaged for whatever reason.
Okay, that's an interesting backstory. I haven't heard that one before. Now, how long have you been doing this, Kylie?
Oh, too long to count. When you say this, I don't know if you mean teaching, which is a long time.
I guess since TAGS was introduced to you.
Oh, well, TAGS is I think the file is a collector's item now. It's not a thing anymore. Gifted and Talented Education in the Department of Education WA has certainly evolved since then, some for good and some for not so great. But I've been doing education consultancy work for about 6 years in my own business, and then another 8 years before that, and then working in gifted and talented roles probably for 6 or so, 8 years before that as well, and dabbling in it even as a classroom teacher.
Mm-hmm. So we could say,
do the maths.
20 odd years, at least 20 years somewhere in this space.
Yes, let's go with that, at least 20 years.
Okay, fantastic. What do you find is the most frustrating thing about the role, and what stops you from helping more kids?
That's a great question. I think the most frustrating thing is that despite the huge amount of knowledge and research that we have in the field of gifted education and how best to teach gifted kids, teachers and school leaders still just don't know about it. They're just not taught, so they are ignorant through no fault of their own. So it's really frustrating, I think, to always have to start again at the beginning of the message. I would love it to be true that if I've been in this game for 20 years, that I'm talking about different things now to what I was 20 years ago. But the frustrating thing is I'm just not. I'm still talking right back at Gifted and Talented Education 101 almost everywhere I go. If I put my positive hat on, I certainly have seen some progress, but it is really frustrating when I go to schools and teachers are still asking, really, are there really gifted kids out there? Are they really any different? Do they really need my help? Why are we doing this training? Aren't these kids going to be fine anyway? So I would love to see more training for teachers, both in their pre-service education and also once they've become fully qualified teachers, so that it's just one of those topics that's available to teachers in their training, just like they learn about literacy, or like they learn about teaching their subject area, maths or whatever it might be. I would love it, gifted education, to just be part of the norm and all teachers talk about it. And there still might be varying degrees of understanding, but at least it's consistently on the table as a topic in their training, and it just isn't. And that is really frustrating. So I often have to be extremely patient, take a big deep breath when I go to schools and start from the beginning.
Okay, now you mentioned that Gifted 101. Some of the audience that are listening to this would not know what gifted is at all. So they might be confusing it with gifted and talented testing for specialist school or selective schools and that sort of stuff. The word gifted is has so many connotations and so many different meanings. So can you, in your own words as a professional education consultant, tell us exactly what gifted is?
Well, my own words will include the words from research, because I have to do it that way. Yes, the word gifted can mean a lot of different things in a lot of different contexts, but in the educational context, and particularly in the Australian educational context, generally we refer to gifted using Francois Garnier's definition, Gagne. There are a lot of other definitions for giftedness, but Garnier's definition is the one that's referred to in most educational policies throughout Australia, federally and state as well. So Garnier talks about giftedness as being the top 10% of the population who have a natural aptitude or potential. So people who are able to process abstract concepts, they're often able to think and remember things more quickly than other people. As young children, they're likely to move through the developmental phases more quickly. So the phases of play, sense of humour, so that we see children and young people and adults who have a bit of a mismatch or feel as though they're a little bit alienated from other people their age, because they're thinking in more advanced ways, or they're able to process or compute in more advanced ways. And so Garnier calls that giftedness or potential, or sometimes we call it aptitude. And the difference between that word and talent, according to Garnier, is that talent is the manifestation of that giftedness. So when people are taking or harnessing their aptitude and turning it into performance or achievement, that's when we would call that talent. So a lot of teachers, when they think of gifted and talented, they think of children who are already performing very highly. They're very successful, and often people assume that gifted and talented children are children who have it all together. They're the kids that are well behaved, they're compliant, they're organised, they're polite, they have good manners, they have a good work ethic, and they're probably likely to succeed anyway. But the research tells us that some gifted kids may be like that, but most gifted kids are not. And most gifted kids actually feel very unmotivated at school if they're bored for many years in a row. They can feel very alienated from their peers. They can feel very misunderstood and, start to feel very frustrated and down because, they can't see other children like them, or they feel like school is not really meeting their needs. We also see gifted students who may have something else going on for them, such as a disability, for example, and we call those gifted students twice exceptional. So they've got one exceptionality in the gifted space, and they've got another exceptionality perhaps in the disability space, or they might have a background of trauma or any other thing that's going on. And often those students are overlooked as well. So I often hear teachers say to me, oh, I've got a lot of bright students in my class, or I've got a few clever kids who ask good questions, but I don't think I have any gifted and talented kids, or I might have one. But if Garnier is talking about the top 10%, we should be looking for a lot more than one child in each classroom. So it's a challenge to get teachers to think about giftedness as more than just that well-rounded, perfect child who appears on the surface to be a genius. That's not the only type of child we're looking for when we're looking for gifted kids.
Well, you talk about the achievements and the straight A student, the teacher pleaser, some might call it. How do we actually identify that if a gifted child presented themselves as a straight A student, which may be possible, versus, say, a not gifted student that just has worked really hard, goes to tuition and just practices, does all the homework, etc., and also presents himself as an A? How do we tell the difference?
Great question, and something I talk to teachers about a lot. We certainly don't want to undervalue kids who are working hard, and they're doing their homework and they've got a great work ethic and they're performing well because they're working hard. But the way we tell the difference is by making sure in a learning environment that we're providing experiences for all students that allow them to think in abstract ways. So providing questions, for example, that are high order questions, that are abstract questions, opportunities to problem solve, opportunities to create and evaluate and offer opinions, and those kinds of types of thinking and learning that don't just require an answer to a question. Because what happens when we have kids who work hard is often they're in environments where there's a lot of rote learning. There's a lot of, here's the information and I want you to repeat it back to me. And that's where we see kids able to perform really well. But what we want to do is throw into the mix the abstract questions, the questions that really make kids think, to see who starts to pop out the top and to see who starts to falter. Because often we see those really hardworking kids who may not be gifted really start to not be able to handle that kind of abstract thinking. And then that can give us some idea. And it's not necessarily that we want to say you're gifted and you're not, but that is a way that we can start to tease out who's hardworking. But really when the thinking starts to get difficult, and often this happens in year 11 and 12, for example, or when they get to university, actually they just have never been exposed to that type of thinking, so they're not able to handle it. I should point out that sometimes that happens for genuinely gifted kids as well, that they also enjoy getting everything right, doing rote learning, and that they also find it sometimes a challenge when they're given abstract thinking that doesn't just have one answer to a question. So it's just as important for our gifted students to be exposed to that type of learning as well, so they can really start to stretch their brains and do something with that giftedness that they've got.
So this would be, I guess, thinking more like Bloom's taxonomy, higher up in Bloom in the triangle.
Yes.
Is that what you're talking about? The higher order
so for people who are familiar with Bloom's taxonomy, the top 3 levels of Bloom's are all considered to be high order. So that's when we're asking students to do things like analyze, synthesize, evaluate, create. But also other taxonomies like the solo taxonomy, for example, the top 2 levels of that, where we're asking students to make connections between ideas and start to think about how one set of ideas can impact on another set of ideas. For example, asking students to not just learn about economics, for example, but to consider, well, what is our knowledge of economics in this situation? How does it impact on geography? How does it impact on population? How does it impact on politics? How does it impact on how we look after the environment? So that we're connecting ideas in different ways. And there are lots of other ways as well, and other models that can help us to pitch that thinking up, so that we're constantly challenging our gifted kids to really use their minds and become familiar with what that feels like to have to actually work hard, as opposed to sit there and perhaps be bored or just always get everything right.
I love what you said about getting hard, things getting difficult in year 11 and 12 or at university level, because one of the things that I have been told about with gifted kids is that they just haven't learnt to learn, because everything comes so naturally to them, seemingly without even trying. They just get it. And then when they hit that roadblock, they just don't have the coping mechanism. Can you give us some more insight into that area, Kylie? And what happens to these kids? This is what I always wonder. I see some friends or some people that I went to school that are extremely smart, and then after a couple of years, you never see them at university, or you never hear from them again. What happened to these guys?
Yeah, it's interesting. You've asked a couple of questions there. The one about learning to learn is really important, and it's a big message that I try to say to teachers all the time, right down to teachers of kindergarten age students, the very younger students that come into our school, making sure that they're actually coming to school and genuinely learning and getting challenging learning is so important, because as you're hinting at, otherwise they just don't learn those lovely skills that all of our average and low average students learn every day, which is how to try, how to persist when something's difficult, how to be okay with that uncomfortable feeling that I don't know how to do this and perhaps I'm not going to work this out straight away. A lot of our gifted students never or experience those feelings. And so if ever the day comes that they do experience something that's genuinely difficult for the first time, they do often fall apart and often think, well, there must be something wrong with me. Maybe I'm not as clever as I thought I was. The teacher's giving us work that's too hard, and they don't have the sense of their own academic self-efficacy, their own ability to put learning strategies in place to help themselves overcome a difficulty because they've never had to before. So that's really important. And then what often happens for these kids in the long term is that we see a huge rise in perfectionism. As an example, we know that perfectionism is something that's being experienced by gifted children at a younger and younger age. And we know that for many gifted children, it can be prevented by making sure that they are genuinely experiencing challenging learning and having to try and persist from the earliest age. But when they never have to do that, then of course they become very comfortable with never making a mistake, with always getting the highest mark in the class. And then in the long term, they just don't have those resilience skills. And for many gifted adults, they will report that the first time they ever felt genuinely challenged was at university. But for some people, not even until they started a master's degree or a doctorate degree. And then as an adult, suddenly they're questioning their whole identity of, was I ever really gifted in the first place because this is difficult for me? And they don't realize that that's how most people go through their life. Like most days are kind of difficult and you need coping strategies. So the outcomes are not good when we're not teaching kids resilience. And we can't assume that gifted kids are just going to pick it up just by being at school day to day. They need to be learning it the way every other child is learning it, which is coming to school and thinking, I might not get everything the first time today, but that's okay because I might get it tomorrow. We want our gifted kids to learn those same lessons as well.
That's very interesting because in the classes that I run at Young Engineers, we always talk about personal bests and pegging effort as the KPI or as the indicator, as opposed to getting a straight A or as opposed to finishing a particular lesson. So it's really, really interesting what you said.
That's really important message for teachers to send their whole class, that they really do value effort. But it's tricky. A lot of gifted kids get really mixed messages about that when they're young in particular. You know, the gifted child who finishes first or is able to write before anybody else in the class can write. And they get a lot of praise for that. Often teachers and parents will say, oh, look what you can do, or you did that so quickly, or aren't you so clever, or goodness, look at the way you write. But if that skill wasn't actually difficult for that gifted child, often the gifted child is confused by all of this praise for something that was actually pretty easy for them. And so teachers need to be really careful with the effort message, because yes, we need to value effort. But we need to make sure that the learning is challenging enough so that gifted kids are actually having to put in effort, so that when they get the praise, they actually understand what they're being praised for. Because otherwise, young kids can start to think, well, you're praising me. I didn't have to work very hard at this. So maybe what you're valuing is just the fact that I'm smarter or I'm faster or I'm somehow different to everybody else. So the praise for effort has to go with genuinely challenging learning that's making them think, so that we can genuinely say, I could see that you were really struggling with that and you didn't give up and you kept going and I'm so proud of you. And that's the effort message that starts to sink in.
I kind of think back to the, I can't remember the name of the film, but it was the Indian mathematician Ramanujan.
Yes.
I remember a scene in the movie when he was talking to the professor. He just said, look, these formulas just come to me in my dreams, in my sleep.
Yeah.
It's kind of like that, isn't it?
I think it's called The Man Who Knew Infinity.
Something like that.
I
Yeah,
think that's it. I do often mention that film actually to teachers, because a lot of teachers will say to me, well, the gifted kids that I have don't know how to do their working out, or they can't in their maths. They refuse to do any working out, or they get annoyed when, I ask them to do their working out, or when a teacher says, how did you work that out? They'll say, just your example that you just gave, well, it just popped into my head. It was just there. And they will never learn to do their working out until they actually have to. And that's why that movie that you mentioned is a great example, that it wasn't until that man got to, was it Oxford or Cambridge University,
That's right.
that suddenly he realized he was an extraordinarily gifted mathematician, but he didn't know how to show his working out. So he wasn't successful for many years because he couldn't show his proofs. So no one else could prove his theorems. And then that was a huge disadvantage for him. A big lesson that, again, it's not just about forcing gifted kids to do the working out if they don't need to do it. We have to make the learning challenging enough so that they can see the need to actually use learning strategies like showing their working out to actually help themselves. Otherwise, they just think, well, all these silly teachers are asking me to do all this working out, and I have no idea why, when I can just figure it out in my head. Bless them.
Yeah, that's kind of hilarious, actually, isn't it? Lots of kids, lots of gifted kids are not necessarily motivated by the same sort of rewards as neurotypical kids, shall we say. Some kids may be rewarded by straight A's or some sort of merit certificate and those sort of things, whereas maybe gifted kids see a difference. That they think about rewards and awards differently. How do you see that play out in the classroom normally?
Yeah, you certainly do get some gifted children who are externally motivated like that, by praise and high grades and things like that. And sometimes that can come from their family context or their cultural context. And certainly Betts and Neihart, the researchers in their profiles, identify what they call a type 1 successful personality type amongst gifted learners, that are those kids that tend to be motivated extrinsically. One of the problems, though, for those kids is that that can also lead to perfectionism, because they're always striving to please everybody else and not necessarily internally fulfilled. But they're only a minority. As you say, the majority of gifted kids are motivated by other things, often motivated by learning itself. Often gifted kids have a lot of goals in life, even from a very young age. They want to discover things. They want to learn how things work. They want to pull a machine apart to figure out how it goes back together again. They want to cure cancer. They want to solve world problems. They want to work for NASA. So often they have very lofty goals about wanting to engage with the real world and solve real world problems, or be creative. And often they have many more goals than they can, sort of handle in a lifetime. And so often what they need is to be highly engaged in their learning. And then we see sometimes gifted kids will choose to be only engaged in some things because they're engaged, they are actively wanting to be engaged in the things that interest them, that match their goals, and not necessarily in all the mundaneness that school can often be, when all those other things seem easy or don't relate to what they're interested in.
Now let's look at a typical classroom with 25, 30 kids. You're a pre-primary or year 1 teacher, or maybe even a kindy teacher, ELC, and you find a child who's reading Harry Potter books, tons and tons of them, new Harry Potter books, several hundred pages every week, whereas the rest of the kids are still probably doing like really basic reader books. How do you accommodate to a student like that who's so far different to all the other kids in terms of literacy, in terms of comprehension, and in terms of some of the things you were saying, like they want to save the world, they're thinking about all these really complex abstract concepts, whereas other kids maybe just want to get to recess and play in the sandpit.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a real big problem for teachers, isn't it?
It's a huge challenge. We know even in a classroom, if they didn't have any highly gifted kids, differentiating for all the different abilities in a classroom is still a really challenging task for teachers. And that's an area that I train in as well. And teachers continue to grapple with how to do differentiation well to cater for a range of abilities. But then when you throw into a mix a child like what you're talking about, and I work with a lot of classrooms and teachers where there is a child like that, where they don't just have the normal range of abilities, but now they've also got this child who is not going to be engaged by any of the regular kindy or pre-primary activities. Really difficult for a teacher. If you think about in a kindergarten class, for example, as a kindergarten teacher, you're not even teaching reading yet. So if you get a child who comes in, they can already read, perhaps has taught themselves how to read, and they're ready to learn how to write. You've got a teacher going, how do I even make this work logistically in my classroom? Because nobody else in this classroom is ready to learn to write. I don't even have lessons prepared for that. What do I do with this child? So it is really difficult. The other thing that we see as well in early childhood in particular, that a lot of early child teachers are trained to notice the developmental phases that children go through and be very interested in making sure that children have really rich play experiences. And so a lot of early childhood teachers get worried that when a child's reading Harry Potter and they don't want to play in the same way that the other kids, that there's something wrong with them, that they need to stay longer in kindergarten to catch up all their social skills that they don't seem to have. When actually what we see is that they've moved through all those developmental phases, and all the other kids in kindy are actually not an appropriate intellectual peer. Then there's no one there in that classroom then that child can talk to about what they're interested in, let alone learn how to write with. Learning is meant to be collaborative, and yet if these kids are so isolated in a classroom, then that learning isn't collaborative and we're not really meeting their needs. If you've got a really extraordinary child like that, then we need to be talking about strategies like acceleration, for example, and some children who are gifted may be appropriate. It may be appropriate to grade skip them. That's not appropriate for all gifted children, but it's certainly something that we need to consider as an option. Because we need to make sure that they're learning at the end of the day. If we just say, well, let's just leave this child here so they can play a bit more and hopefully make a friend, we're not doing them any favors. We're not building their resilience by giving them challenging learning. We're not including them socially. And we're putting a teacher under a lot of pressure as well to essentially try to teach a child at almost a year 2 level or beyond when they've got a classroom full of other 4 or 5-year-olds. So we need to be looking at other strategies, and acceleration can be a really useful one. It's one that a lot of teachers and schools in Australia remain very nervous about, despite decades of research, but it certainly needs to be one that we become more comfortable with.
Okay, that's very interesting. Now, I want to take you back to the self-efficacy and building resilience, and also some of the activities that might help students to build that resilience and so forth. In young engineers classes, we have a little sort of methodology or philosophy where we get the kids to line up and show their working or submit their Lego building to be checked each and every step by the educator. So we always think that from an efficiency point of view, it makes things go a little bit quicker and a bit more efficient. Yeah. But what we've also found in recent times is that actually that has some positive psychology as well. You're getting kids to get off their backside to seek answers, which I guess is positive psychology, to try and give them a problem-solving sort of mindset. And also we're getting them to submit their work to the educators, to give them a go at taking some risks, I guess. Do you see that sort of strategy in the traditional classroom much? And if not, what sort of other strategies do teachers use to try and get their kids to just try and take risks, take more risks, just have a go and try and be wrong, and not be so scared about making mistakes?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because I don't actually think that a lot of teachers have a lot of training in what to do. And the reality is that a lot of kids who come to school every day, and school's a bit tough, average to low average kids who, they come to school and things are a bit difficult, are often building that resilience very naturally. Those kids who come to school, because I work in disability as well, I often think of the child who comes to school and he was in trouble yesterday, and today he's really determined he's not going to poke anyone, and he's not going to get in trouble, and he's going to put his hand up, and he's also going to try and concentrate on his writing because he really doesn't like writing, but he needs to try. And every day he's learning resilience just because he's making a million little decisions to keep going. So because of that, teachers are not taught a lot of skills about how to build resilience, because usually for most kids they don't have to. But if we're talking about those gifted kids, the first strategy has to be challenging learning from the beginning, so that right from kindy, as I've mentioned, they get used to the fact that most days I have to come back and I may not know how to do stuff. That's the biggest challenge to start with. But then from there, it is about encouraging risk taking. I like the strategy that you guys have got in your program to get kids to come and check their work, not just because they're getting it checked, because I'm assuming that kind of process makes them actually articulate their thinking and say, well, I did this because, or I think this is the way it will work best because, or maybe I'll change this to make it do this. And getting kids to articulate their thinking is a really important way to encourage kids to take risks and look at alternate ways to solve problems, and not just go with the first idea that they had or the first solution that they had. I think when kids are engaged in learning and genuinely have a problem to solve that they are interested in, that in and of itself will always encourage risk taking. The problem is if you've got a student that is so afraid to make a mistake that they never come and engage with that process because they don't want to be told that it's not right, or they feel like, I want to get it perfect before I show anyone, or if it's not absolutely perfect and the best in the class, then I'm not going to be happy with it, so I'm not going to attempt it at all. And that's when we start to see perfectionism become unhealthy. It can be a useful strategy to talk to gifted children about perfectionism itself and the difference between healthy and unhealthy perfectionism, and to talk to kids about this idea that healthy perfectionism helps us do better. It helps us excel. It helps us solve problems. But unhealthy perfectionism stops us from doing better. It stops us from being creative. It stops us from enjoying our learning. It stops us from achieving excellence. So that we're trying to encourage mistake making and rewarding mistake making. It's really important as well for teachers to talk to their classes and model for their classes what making a mistake and taking a risk looks like. And often teachers, particularly in the early years, because of the nature of teaching 4 and 5 and 6-year-olds, have extremely structured classrooms where the teachers themselves are not often comfortable with risk taking, because they need all their 4-year-olds to be safe, for example. So they have highly structured lessons, and it's hard to encourage risk taking when lessons are very, very structured. So structure is useful, but again, the challenge has to be there and the problem solving has to be there to help kids engage. And sometimes we have to actually force it a little bit and encourage those kids to say, I really want you to make a mistake because I think that's something that you need to learn how to do, and make sure that we praise when we notice that and say, you know what, I can see that you're not happy with what you've created, or I can see that you feel like it could be better, but you've come to get feedback about it anyway. You've come to articulate some of your thinking and think about it in new ways. I'm so proud of you for giving it a go. Another big one that we see schools do is things like the Evening of Eminence or Night of the Notables, which is a nice activity where students in the class choose a person of eminence, so usually an inventor or something like that. And the idea is that they research their lives and the process of their work. And the point is for gifted kids is to learn that even our most eminent and successful inventors and mathematicians and scientists didn't just overnight come up with the theorem that they're famous for, or the invention that they're famous for. They had to actually fail many, often thousands of times before they could perfect whatever it was that they were trying to invent. So making sure that we're offering models as well of how failure can be really important to success. Whereas when we just say to kids, well done all the time for their first effort, especially to gifted kids who didn't have to work hard at that first effort, it keeps sending this message of this is who I am. I'm the person who gets it right all the time, because that's what the adults around me tell me. So I need to keep being that person, because otherwise, who am I? And we see that in adults as well. Perfectionism can be crippling for many people.
I've seen several different manifestation of perfectionism in the kids that I've come across. One of them is children who just refuse to do anything. They appear actually to be disengaged, and in fact, it looks as if they don't know how to do the things. Whereas in fact, once upon a time, I identified this and I kind of separated these two girls, because I thought this girl was very smart, but she was just not doing anything and hiding behind her partner, who was doing all the work in building all the Lego models. And then once we separated her and then we had a chat to the grandfather, we found out that she was in fact like really quite advanced in music and in a few other areas at school. And then that's where we kind of got, oh, hang on, maybe she's just hiding it all and don't want to make a mistake when she comes up to get her work checked. That when we separated her and she was working solo, and then we gave her some encouragement, then she was able to get through that. And I've even heard of things like students just doing worksheets and then rubbing out all the mistakes, even though those worksheets were never going to be submitted or checked by anyone else. I mean, that just does my head in. That's mind-boggling. I mean, I can see where you're coming from, that it could be crippling, because that's just totally illogical to people that are not in that space, I guess. So how do we pick it up? What are some of the other symptoms or some of the signals that we should be looking at to try and identify these kids that might be suffering from such a condition?
Yeah. I think teachers actually are very good at identifying perfectionism, and it usually manifests in two different ways, and you've mentioned both. One is I'm so afraid of making a mistake that I'm not going to even attempt it in the first place, or not hand it in even if I've worked hard on something. So avoidance, to avoid failure. Which I must say that as adults, we do tend to do that a little bit. Usually once we're adults, we choose activities that we enjoy, that we know we're good at, that we think we're going to be good at. It's hard for people to take risks at something they're not sure about. The other way that perfectionism can manifest, which often worries teachers less, although it shouldn't necessarily be the case, is students who do way too much in an effort to make it more perfect. So teachers, all they wanted was a paragraph, and kids have written, 10 pages and put borders around every page and coloured in the petals on the borders and, all these things that the teacher never wanted. And sometimes these are the students whose parents will ring the school and say, my child is doing way too much homework. You're putting too much pressure on my child. And the teacher's response is, I didn't tell them to do any of that. That's not necessary. All the things they think they have to do, it's not necessary. So perfectionism can manifest in those two different ways usually. And sometimes it's not just perfectionism around academic work, like the girl that you just mentioned, for example. Sometimes we do see with gifted students that their social awareness is very highly attuned, that's an area of their giftedness, not for all, but for some. We know that the higher a child's IQ, the younger they start to do what we call social norming. So look around the room and start to figure out, how is everyone else behaving here? How should I fit in? So it may actually be that girl was not worried about the academic, the activity that you were doing, so much as trying to fit in with the girl that she was paired with originally, and trying to get that social connection perfect. So sometimes we see it manifest in that way as well, that she's actually holding herself back from doing perhaps what she would really love to do, in an effort to make sure that this child doesn't see her as unusual, that this child's ideas are accepted, for example, so that it can manifest in social ways as well. Even to the point where you see kids socially who desperately want to wear the right brand clothing to fit in with their peer group. They have to have, their cap with just the right brand and the logo and just the right angle and, all of those kind of things. We see also with perfectionism that some kids will move into unhealthy perfectionism because they've already got an underlying anxiety disorder, whether that's diagnosed or not. And usually when we see kids who are very young who already have very unhealthy perfectionism and teachers are worried about them, often the way to deal with that is actually through professional counselling and addressing the anxiety first. But for the majority of other kids, if perfectionism starts to appear a bit later, then it's often because they're not experiencing that challenging work and they don't actually understand that being gifted is not just about getting everything right all the time. Sometimes we do see this in children who have heard the word gifted or clever or smart, those kinds of words, a lot of times, or they've been accepted into programs that have that vocabulary. There's nothing wrong with using the vocabulary, but sometimes what gifted students feel is that, well, I got into that gifted program and people keep telling me I'm smart, so that must mean that I have to always get everything right. I have to be the best in the class. I should never need the teacher's help. Things should never feel hard. And then that's the type of thinking that can really turn into unhealthy perfectionism if we're not giving challenging learning, encouraging risk-taking, celebrating mistakes, all of those kinds of things.
Okay. So I'm just a bit conscious of time, so maybe one more question, Kylie. Now, we've got hundreds of educators out there with young engineers that are teaching kids either in incursions or co-curricular or extracurricular classes all around Australia. How do we handle the situation where we might suspect that one of the kids that we teach have this perfectionism, especially unhealthy perfectionism? How do we bring it up to parents, or how do we bring it up with the school that we work with? Because that's a really tricky thing that I recently encountered. Am I going to cause some sort of undue anxiety by bringing up with the parents? But then again, if I think, oh man, if ever I caught up with this guy or this girl 10 years later and they just were crippled by this condition, and if I didn't say anything about it, or I could have done something 10 years ago and I didn't, I'd be absolutely, just kicking myself. I wouldn't be able to live with myself. So how do you handle it sensitively and yet, be proactive?
Yeah, that's a great consideration. I don't think I would recommend, of course, going up to a parent and saying, I worked with your child today and I think that they are an unhealthy perfectionist. Obviously that's not quite the sensitive approach that we would want. But I think it is useful to be able to say to parents, this is what I noticed when your child was doing this activity today. I noticed that they really struggled when they felt they were going to make a mistake, or when they did make a mistake. And I noticed that they were really reluctant to try new things, for example. I would just stick with what has been observed, what you've directly observed. For example, the girl that you mentioned before, that I've noticed that when she came away from her partner, she was much more open to trying new things. And I really encourage you as the parent to build up their resilience to take risks, to make mistakes and be okay with that. And that's something that parents can do in the home. And I do often say that to parents, just have a think about, maybe are there opportunities at home or in the other activities they do outside of school to make mistakes, to try an activity that they've never tried before, to be messy. How do you in the home model mistake making? Do you sometimes tell a story of something that you got wrong during the day and how you handled it? And perhaps that you were frustrated with yourself, but you made a decision that you're going to try again tomorrow, and actually saying some of those things out loud to our young children so that they're seeing that it's important to have those strategies and that everybody makes mistakes. Often gifted kids They observe so much in the world. So they're observing all the adults. And if all they see are adults that they think are getting everything right all the time, of course, we know that that's just not true of any of us. And they start to develop this unrealistic perception of what perfection looks like. So it is really important that we're modeling it. And that can be a really nice way to say to parents, this is what I've noticed. I'd really love to see them be much more comfortable making mistakes. I'd really love to see them be more comfortable to take a risk. I'd really love to see them show me their work before it's finished so that we can talk about the process and not just the final product, and just give those really practical suggestions and encourage parents to work on that at home as well in terms of making mistakes and taking risks. I will often say to parents, make sure that in your gifted child's life, there's at least one activity that they're doing or they've done in the past that they had to actually work at and they weren't good at it the first time they tried. Like, make them stick with that one sport, for example, for 6 months or a year and say, I know that you're not good at it, but this is the thing that we're going to practice. We might never be perfect at it. And that's kind of the point. You need to be able to have an example in your child's life that you can say to them later, remember when you were learning to ride your bike or you were learning to play the piano and it wasn't easy and you had to practice, and remember how proud of yourself you were when you finally mastered it and how enjoyable that feeling was. That's the feeling that we want you to have when you're doing all your other learning at school. So it's important that they've got an example, because if they've never experienced failure or never experienced things feeling difficult, it's really hard to convince them that taking a risk or making a mistake is going to be a good thing.
And with that, Kylie, thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Fantastic tips, and I'm sure this will be very useful for hundreds, if not thousands, of educators.
I hope that they're helpful.
To help many more gifted kids to strive and be better. Thank you very much for all your assistance.
You're welcome. Thanks, Chee.